Hi kids! So we left off on chapter 38 and it was when they finally, Zero and Stanley, finally reached the top of the Big Thumb and they found water. And they also, the last thing where it ended off, where they found something smooth and round and it ended up being an onion. And that's where we kind of like put two and two together and we're like, oh, maybe that was Sam. That's where Sam got his onions. So let's read chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at the giant rock tower. It was layered and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while, just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and throat were coated with sand. And no wonder. When he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth, then swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he tried again. How you doing? It hurt to talk. Not good, Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped up some water. Then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down to the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deep. Maybe that would give him cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath, then walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice and touched it. Tag, you're it. Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked up one flower. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead each flower was really a cluster of tiny little flowers that formed around a ball. He brought it to his mouth, but had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon, while this trail was still fresh. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying doubled over on his side. I got to tell you something, he said with a groan. Don't talk, said Stanley. Save your strength. No, listen, Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as his face twisted with pain. I'm listening, Stanley whispered. I took your shoes, Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. That's all right, he said. Just rest now. It's my fault, said Zero. It's nobody's fault, said Stanley. I didn't know, Zero said. That's okay, Stanley said. Just rest. Zero closed his eyes, but then again, he said, I didn't know about the shoes. What shoes? From the shelter. It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? I'm sorry, said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer. While the wolf awaits below, hungry and alone, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. Now, when we were trying to think about why Stanley ended up there, it was when he was trying to tell the boys that the shoes Clyde Livingston's shoes fell out of nowhere, out of the air, and that's how and why he got arrested, because they thought that he was the one to steal Clyde Livingston's shoes. But now Zero, as you can see, he just confessed and said that it was him, that he's the one who took them. So what I'm thinking is that he took them and he somehow, since they fell out of the air, he probably threw them. He was above Stanley, and that's how Stanley got the shoes. So let's read chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gracefully. But now, as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and tried to rub out the pain. Then he bent down and dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. "Onions! Fresh, hot, sweet onions!" Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down Main Street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shores. Mrs. Glades Tennyson was wearing her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. She was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat, so it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping at his mule cart. "Good morning, Miss Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you. I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserves most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes," agreed Gladys, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word," he said. "They would suck out the bad blood. Now, you tell me, how would a leech know which blood is good and which is bad?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Gladys. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," said Gladys. "Does your husband know you're parading about in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you. We have both been up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Gladys, "but it nearly killed Becca. What with her being so young, Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hattie said. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself, then turned and quickly walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it, she can come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Miss Gladys bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'd appreciate it." "All right, then. Give me my change in onions." Sam gave Miss Gladys an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days, ate onions all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said. as if he had no other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail as he made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure he was going the right way, but it just took a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downward, just in case. He came to a bare spot between two large patches of weeds and sat down to rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds, a little farther down the mountains. It didn't seem likely that the shovel would be there, but he had already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken, except the one which had broken earlier. And if they had rolled down the hill, it was doubtful that he would found them side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. And that's the end of chapter 40. So caveman Stanley went out to go look for the shovel so he can dig the mud and find clean water. And now that he found the shovel, he's going to make his way back, hopefully with enough strength to dig his hole. And we'll see what happens next. Have a great day.